Welcome back, friends. And in case you missed anything on MGO Blue podcast, just a little update here. The radio replay of Inside Michigan Football, that's already out. Happened last night. It is now available on the feed. My guest, as always, Sharon Moore. My assistant coach was wide receiver coach Ron Bellamy. And my player at the end of the program was Tyler Morris. So if you missed any of that, go back, download, listen. And then today, which is already out, Conquering Heroes normally comes out on Thursday, but we flopped things because I had a special guest, and that is the Donald R. Shepard, Director of Athletics at the University of Michigan, Warde Manuel, stopped by to talk a little bit about the NCAA versus the House and the outcomes of that, what it means for Michigan athletics. He sent out a letter last week to student athletes, to alumni, season ticket holders, and just had some questions that we want to clarify. And we're going to continue to have those updates on the Conquering Heroes podcast with Warde Manuel as more questions arise. And we're going to talk about it a little bit later on in the program today, but there's so much that is still undecided. The details all have to be worked out. The decision actually has to be final. So if you want to get an update, go to the Conquering Heroes podcast and you'll get a chance to hear that. Still to come. Like I mentioned, we swapped Conquering Heroes and Defend the Block with Brian Bush. His guest this week, which will come out on Thursday, that is women's basketball freshman Olivia Olson. So make sure you catch that one on Thursday afternoon, about 5 o'clock. My keys to the game. We were off last week because of the bye. Back this week, so keys to the game against Illinois, little locker room speech, and then Sunday, the recap of the game against Illinois. Also the recap, because there are some exhibition games going on of the women's basketball game against Oakland. To talk a little bit more about that, I'm going to bring in my partner, Mr. Brian Bush. Brian, how you doing? You ready for basketball season?
Yeah, that exhibition is men's basketball. It's at Little Caesars Arena. Excited to see Greg Campy and the stories of college basketball last year. Oakland, what they did against Kentucky in the first round, almost getting to the Sweet 16. Heck of a game against an NC State team that ended up going to the Final Four. So yeah, excited about that on Sunday. Busy time for us all. So let's get into our 7 from 77. John, you've been around the building. How would you describe the benefits, the impact of the bye week around Schembechler Hall?
Well, it's a chance to reset, and it is exactly midseason. You got 6 games under your belt. You got 6 games in the regular season to go, and it was use the analogy of, anytime you get an issue with the computer, clearly there were issues with the offense, defense, had some issues on special teams. Anytime I got a problem with the computer, I unplug, let it turn off, turn it back on, and at least in terms of technology, it seems to work. Now we'll see if that unplug and reset for the Michigan football team, because Sharon Moore talked about these guys needing to get on the practice field and work on all the little details to get some guys healed up. Also to get away for, I think it was Friday and Saturday, to just get a mental reset and take a little time off, let your guard down a little bit. Some of the guys had a chance to visit family and friends. Other guys catch up on academics. Other guys just, needed to lay around, do nothing. And there's great value in that. So hopefully that's part of the equation coming out of the bye week. And the sense that I get is that these guys they feel a little bit rejuvenated. They feel like they are ready to attack the second part of the season.
Number 2 on our 7 from 77. This year, Sharon Moore has been pretty forthcoming about quarterback news. Before week 1, we didn't know until the very end about Davis Warren getting the start over Alex Orji. But since then, we found out pretty early leading into week 4 that Orji would take over for Davis Warren after he started the first 3 games. And then it was pretty much known this time last week that Jack Tuttle would be the starter out of the bye. Tuttle spoke to the media last week. You've gotten to know him a little bit since arriving on campus last year. How would you describe Jack Tuttle as a player, a person, and as an experienced leader here in his 7th season of college football?
Well, I've had a chance to interview him a couple of times for the podcast. I've been around him, and as you would expect from a guy that's been around college football now 7 years, he's a very knowledgeable individual. And sometimes that knowledge can be power. Other times it can be, and Sharon's talked about trying to take a little pressure off, because he beat himself up pretty good about those 2 turnovers. And I know he has the pressure of wants to come in, and be a guy that turns things around for this offense, that puts them into a position where, yeah, they can be dynamic, they can throw the ball downfield. He wants to be the guy that can operate this offense at a high level, and he's got this calm demeanor. When I talked to him last year, I asked him the question, why would you come to Ann Arbor when you know JJ's going to be the starter? And, a lot of guys want to, be able to start their final year or two in college football. And one of the things he talked about was not just in terms of playing, it was the success he felt the program was going to have. It's also what he wants to do when his playing career is over. He wanted to learn from this coaching staff. Coaching seems to be something in his future. When you have a guy on the field that has that mindset in regards to studying the game, you always want it from every player. But when you have that in-depth desire to understand more about the offense, why things are happening, why you're doing things, looking at the defense with a different perspective, I think that calm demeanor, that sense of having a guy out there that understands everything that's going on around him will be an asset for Michigan football.
Number 3 on our 7 from 77, as you have prepared for this week, in your eyes, how similar, how different, what do you expect from an offense where Jack Tuttle's leading the way and he knows going into the game that he will be the starting quarterback?
Well, I expect that we're not just going to have 3 individual receivers with 1 catch. I think they're going to be able to spread the ball around. They're going to be able to attack the field downfield. And now the question is going to be what type of improvements have gone around him, because I think the entire playbook is going to be available. And I know he's still recovering from the injury, and it's they talked about the arm event, but it's one that, is he going to have the power and the strength to get downfield? How many times can he do that downfield? Can he put some zip on the ball to fit it in a tight window? I think, he can. So it's going to open up a lot for the offense. And we saw it in that game where, he's looking to one side of the field, goes through his progressions 1, 2, and 3, and then nothing's there. So he dumps it off to Donovan Edwards on the opposite side of the field. He's got that awareness, that presence, so that the entire field is open to him. He's also a guy that can get to the line of scrimmage and can have a couple of plays that have been called from the sideline and put the team in the best position possible, depending on what the defense presents. And, you can have a great play called and you can be really excited about it. Then all of a sudden, hey, they come out and they're just, if you're running to the 4-hole and they've got linebackers and defensive linemen stacked up there, well, that's not a great play to run. He can get out of it and get into something else that might be a better play for Michigan in that situation. So I think he offers that. And we saw this in Washington when he immediately came in. Safeties backed off a little bit because they had to honor the pass a little bit more. They had to respect the pass. Now all of a sudden that opens up a little bit more for the run game. And we talked about the run game being opened up a little bit more with Alex Orji because they had to hold that backside end. Now, I don't know that they're going to hold that backside end. You may see some more crashing down, and Jack Tuttle can run the ball. We saw that against Washington. But the big thing is backing those safeties up a little bit, getting some, when you run a play action, put those linebackers in conflict. Are they going to come up to try and stop a Khalil Mullins or a Donovan Edwards? Or is this a true play action where they've got to get back off the ball because now you got a quarterback that can threaten every level of the defense?
Number 4 on today's 7 from 77. Of course, we'll get your keys to the game coming up on Thursday afternoon's audio edition of In the Trenches presented by Meyer. But your early synopsis on Brett Bielema's Illini. They needed overtime to knock off one of the worst teams in the Big Ten through the season's first half in Purdue this past Saturday. But that got Illinois to 5-1 and still very much in the thick of a congested Big Ten.
Hey, no one just goes to West Lafayette and comes away with a win. We'll see what Oregon does. And Purdue's one of those teams that every year it seems like they jump up and beat someone. I don't know, that's this year. It was almost Illinois. And some uncharacteristic mistakes in that game for Illinois. It felt like they got up, took the foot off the gas, and then it took them a while before they were able to, hit high speed again. They ultimately came away with the win. But the one thing I know about Brett Bielema, they're probably not going to put 2 games like that back to back. He's a coach that's going to correct the mistakes. Turnovers are not going to be an issue. Drew Altmaier's in his second year as a quarterback there. I've talked about him all season long, and he's a guy that has some really good experience, could throw the ball around. They've got, an offense that can run the ball. And the one thing I know about a Brett Bielema coach team is his focus, his first thing that he tried to do when it was already, part of the system at Wisconsin, but when he went down to Arkansas, now that he's at Illinois, is take care of the line of scrimmage. They're going to be a physical offensive line. They're going to be a physical defensive line. They've had some good players come out of there, technically sound players. So you're going to have to be good up front. And all those little things that Sharon Moore talked about in, offensive line play, hand placement, sets, steps, staying square, getting off on linebackers, all of those are going to be, imperative, because you're going to be playing against a front that is going to be technically sound. They're going to be physical, and they're going to play a violent manner of football.
Before we continue, John, let's get into a word with our friends from Alro Steel.
And if you're interested in a career in metals and plastics distribution, join the team at Alro. Alro Steel and Alro Plastics have over 3,000 teammates in 80 locations covering 16 states. At Alro, you will never receive extensive upfront training with many. You will, sorry, bad mistake there. You will receive extensive upfront training with many opportunities for advancement. Our core values, including loyalty, honesty, and integrity. We offer competitive compensation and an excellent benefits package. Apply today at careers.alro.com.
All right, let's talk Big Ten, number 5 on our 7 from 77. Starting in Eugene. Yes, Big Ten starting in Eugene. That's a real thing. Oregon kind of welcoming itself to the Big Ten. Dan Lanning talked about just how important that game was. He said it since the offseason, and the Ducks delivered with a penalty on purpose, with some bad clock management by Ohio State late, 32-31. Your biggest takeaways from that one?
It was a great college football game. And other than the comeback in the Alabama-Georgia game, it was one of the most exciting ones that I think I've watched all season long. Now, obviously not saddened by the loss by Ohio State, but when you look at both of those teams, they're talented. They got decent quarterback play. I don't know that you're looking at any of those guys that are going to light any other defenses on fire, but physical up front, and very athletic. A lot of speed on the field, wide receivers and defensive backs for Oregon. Same thing for Ohio State. Those are two teams that are playing at a different speed than I think everybody else in the Big Ten right now.
Penn State in overtime, a win over USC. So two programs going in different directions. The Nittany Lions, 6-0. They have one ranked team left. They get Ohio State at home on November 2nd. USC now 1-3 in the Big Ten. What's a bigger surprise to you? The fact that legitimately Penn State might be a home win over Ohio State away from being locked into the Big Ten championship game, or USC 1-3, some close losses, but ones that, hey, in the Big Ten, you've got to find a way to grind out 27-24 at Michigan, 33-30 in a game where, boy, it felt at times like USC had not just a chance, but a good chance to win.
Oh, they had many opportunities. And I think when you think about Lincoln Riley teams, and I know they made some changes on the defensive staff, it's not a switch that you can just turn on and off in regards to physicality on defense. They're going to have to find a way to be more physical on defense, to be more physical up front offensively. They have talent. Miller Moss is a good quarterback, but they've got talented receivers, a number of talented receivers, but you've got to win the physical battle. And I don't know that they were a team that was ready to see what to play in the Big Ten with that style of football. They're going to have to adjust their recruiting, their coaching. They're just going to have to make some major adjustments. Now, Penn State's interesting because their schedule to this point has been one of the easier ones in the country. Obviously, in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they play Ohio State because they're on a bye. But when you look at their opponents, West Virginia, Bowling Green, Kent State, now they, against a ranked team against Illinois, UCLA and USC, I don't think there's anybody that strikes fear into a lot of teams in those first 6 games of their season. They will have a chance against Ohio State. And that's really their one tough game, because the rest of their schedule are teams that are still finding their way. Yes, they play Washington, and as we know, Washington can score some points, but they've got Purdue, Minnesota, Maryland, Wisconsin. They probably have the easiest slate of all the big dogs in the Big Ten, and that's Oregon, that's Ohio State. And looking at those teams, looking at Penn State's schedule, I'm just not sold that they're a really good team right now. They're good. I'm just not sure how good.
It's interesting. There may be a team that always had a tough time getting into the 4-team playoff, who in the first year, the 12-teamer might have been in the top 4. Penn State's a candidate for that based on how this schedule works out, to where they were always in the periphery and contending, but couldn't get it done. And we'll see. They got to beat Ohio State. I will believe that when I see it. But if they do, they're in a really good position, and they would have been in a good position if it were a 4-team playoff.
Yeah, but in the 14 playoff, they also had divisions, and they're not playing the same schedule that they would have played in the Big Ten East. As we know that's a gauntlet. So, they got one tough game against Ohio State. In previous iterations, the reason they couldn't make it to the 14 playoff was because of the divisions and the conference that they were in. Now you take away divisions, and this is the schedule they get. I would expect at this point, being 6-0, even if they lose to Ohio State, they're still going to be a playoff team.
Yep, of course, yeah. 11-1 in one of the big 2, and you're going. Period. Full stop. I don't care what your schedule is like. Iowa bludgeons Washington 40-16. That was a 9 a.m. Pacific time start. 11 a.m. in Iowa City. Washington has that again coming up in a couple weeks with the game times that were established by the Big Ten. But it was Kirk Ferentz' 200th win at Iowa. Ferentz gets some criticism about the offense, and understandably so. But boy, Iowa fans, you can always want more, of course. And they've had some really good teams that have, gotten close to doing some really, really special things and have done some special things. I don't know how many other coaches could have the type of success that Kirk Ferentz has had at Iowa.
Well, I mean, he's been extremely consistent. Year in, year out, he's a guy that's going to put up 9, 10, 11 wins. And, you go back to the divisions, which I talked about. The Big Ten West was not really a threat in the Big Ten, but he has been very consistent. And what they've been very consistent at is really good offensive line play and really good defense to great defenses. And when you play great defense, you're going to win a lot of games, even if your offense is slow. And I know he's taken his criticisms offensively, but when you play really great defense, you're going to win a lot of games. And whether you're SEC, Big Ten, it doesn't matter. Insert conference. You play good defense, you're going to win your fair share of games. And that's that. He knows there's probably nobody that knows his recruiting footprint, what he's looking for, and how it fits into his program more so than Kirk Ferentz.
This weekend, 2 good games. Michigan will be involved in one of them at Illinois. The other one is where Big Noon Kickoff will be. That's Bloomington. Undefeated 16th ranked Indiana hosts Nebraska. Big one there. This is the last real detour and huge challenge for Iowa or for Indiana before potentially coming into the Michigan matchup 9-0.
Yeah, it's remarkable to see what these two teams have done. The resurgence of Nebraska, and I think they're still a year away from Raiola being a quarterback that he's had some young mistakes, and some of those young mistakes have cost him that game. Almost cost him a couple other games, but he's a really good talent and is only getting better. And when you look at Indiana and Kirk Cignetti, their coach, they have 100% taken on his personality in terms of the aggressive style that they play, take no prisoners, and they're out there flying around the field. And it's been fun to it's the first Indiana team that's kind of fun to watch.
Yeah, their offense, they get up and down It will be very interesting to see. I'm excited to watch that one while we're getting ready for Michigan and Illinois. Number 6 on our 7 from 77. People circled October 12th on the calendar back in the spring, and it delivered. I want to start, though, with a game that really did not deliver in terms of excitement, down to the wire, anticipation, nervousness, whatever. Number 1, Texas stops Oklahoma 34-3. This week, Longhorns get Georgia, who held off Mississippi State 41-31. I know Oklahoma is several tiers down from a true national contender. But again, I mean, this Texas team, we talked about it after week 2. This team is really, really good.
They're good. They're talented at all the skill positions. Defensively, they're extremely solid. The one thing, and we know this here in Michigan, when you have a dominant, experienced offensive line, you're going to win a lot of football games, and your team is going to look really good. You pair that with a quarterback like Quinn Ewers, who's coming back off of the injury. You pair that with talent. And here's the thing that is I don't want to say it's surprising. It's a little bit surprising. They're down to their third running back. They lost 2 guys, their top 2 guys, before the season even started. And they're talented at the receiver position. I'm not surprised. And I'm not really surprised that they did this to Oklahoma, because when you look at Oklahoma, they've got a young quarterback, and experience does matter in games like this. Quinn Ewers, you want to talk about experience matters? All he had to do was turn on the film from last year and what happened in that game as motivation, but also as coaching points of how little mistakes, taking your eyes off the wrong thing at the wrong time, can cost you games.
SEC, close calls for Alabama. They win by 2 against South Carolina. That was a wild one. Tennessee knocks off Florida in overtime, 23-17. And a doozy that was alongside Oregon, Ohio State, LSU winning over Ole Miss at home in overtime, 29-26. Your biggest thoughts from those 3 down to the wire SEC games?
Florida's better than I thought they were. And they've got the toughest schedule in college football. To be 3-3 right now, I think is actually doing something for them. And they're a gotcha team. They're not a team that's going to win. I don't even know if they get to bowl eligible, but you got to prepare for them every team. They're scrappy, and they're probably going to have one of those gotcha moments in their schedule where they just jump up and beat someone. Tennessee was lucky to get out of there. Alabama lucky to get out of that South Carolina game. And I mean, I think you're looking at all of these teams. Georgia is not the Georgia that we've known over the past 5 years. Alabama is not the Alabama that we've seen over the past 15, 20 years. And it's some of it is, I know that there's a coaching change in Alabama. Kalen DeBoer is a good coach, but you're looking at parity in college football with NIL, transfer portal, the talent being spread out instead of sitting behind somebody at Alabama and saying, you know what, I'll wait my turn. Now, if you can get paid and play somewhere else, guys are looking for better opportunities elsewhere. And I think that's what you're seeing in the SEC and the Big Ten, really.
Yeah, Florida's schedule. Their 3 losses are to Miami, Texas A&M, and Tennessee, all ranked teams.
Mm-hmm.
They get Kentucky coming up this weekend, and then their November is brutal. Georgia, Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, and then the only unranked team is Florida State, who started the season 10th. They've completely collapsed, but yeah, that's their quote unquote easy game. Yeah, they could be 5-7, and you go, wow, they won more games than they lost in terms of what they were supposed to do.
Right.
It's crazy. Speaking of Miami and the ACC, we, again, don't know how this college football playoff will all line up. So gauging what's going to happen with ACC teams, Big 12 teams, which we'll get to in a second, is really interesting. ACC at least has some bigger names that are relevant. Miami 6-0, Pitt also 6-0, somewhat surprisingly. Clemson's looked good despite the loss to Georgia pretty handily. They're 5-1, as is ACC classic Southern Methodist University, SMU. They're 5-1. Your takeaways on the ACC? Still can't believe Miami won the game against Cal a couple weeks ago, but they're right now holding the flag in terms of national brand trying to get, in essence, what they're fighting for is the 3 seed in that playoff bracket.
Yeah. And I mean, Cal, we saw what they did against Miami, should have won that game. And then what they did against Pitt almost knocked off Pitt. Their team they're kind of one of those gotcha teams as well. They're always kind of really close and right there, but never could find a way to finish the deal. Pitt to me is the surprising team. I think Miami, with Warde as their quarterback, they're going to be just fine. They're going to be in the ACC title game. I think they're probably going to be that team, like you said, that's the 3 seed in the college football playoffs because they ultimately win the ACC. But don't count out Clemson. Clemson was it a one-off against Georgia when they got stomped by Georgia? Or is what we're trying to figure out what the ACC is in regards to top teams. What's the competition like? And we'll start to see some of those things play out the rest of the season.
Yeah, Miami and Clemson don't play in the regular season. So best case in terms of brand scenario would be Miami 12-0, Clemson 11-1, and Charlotte at the ACC championship game. Mm-hmm. Obviously a long way to go to get there. Big 12, I don't know. I can barely remember who's in the Big 12, but Iowa State and BYU lead the way. They're 6-0 overall, 3-0 in league play. Texas Tech is also 3-0 in the league, not undefeated overall. There are 5 teams, 2-1 in the league. The Big 12 needs to avoid a bunch of chaos where their championship game is like a 10-2, 8-1 teams where the winners definitely in because you win the conference title and the losers probably out just based on how the rest of the pecking order looks. It would behoove them to have, if it's 12-0 versus an 11-1, that's kind of what you're going to need there. I just don't know how they get there with how even everything is.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you might have a 12-0 team in BYU. Obviously they got Oklahoma State this weekend. Their next toughest game is probably Utah. That one's going to be in Utah, but I mean, what do we make of Utah right now? I thought they were going to be that team that had a run to win the Big 12, but BYU looks to be the most consistent, most well-rounded team. And with 6 games left, I mentioned Oklahoma State and the Utah. They've got 4 other games at UCF, Kansas at home, at Arizona State, and Houston. And I just don't see anybody on the schedule that really will test BYU. And I think it's BYU, and then whoever else ends up, 10-2. And your ACC and Big 12. I think there could be a mess when it comes to figuring out, unless it's Clemson and Miami, like we mentioned in the ACC, that makes it clean. But there could be a whole lot of 2-loss teams that you've got to try and go through all the tiebreakers with for who's going to face BYU in the Big 12 championship.
And hey, I agree with you on BYU, but I also wouldn't be surprised if we're sitting here a month from now going, boy, what happened to BYU? They're 7-3 now. Like, it's just, you don't know. And Utah lost Cam Rising. He's out for the year. What will be interesting is a 9-3 SEC team the same as, or a 9-3 Big 10 team? Is that the same as a 10-2 Big 12 and ACC team? Is that the same as an 11-1 Big 12 ACC team? We're going to learn that this year. We don't know the answer. We can make our predictions. But remember, the AP and the coaches polls, they mean nothing. And I normally am not a huge fan or locked in on the reveals from the playoff committee during the month of November because we kind of knew what teams needed to do in the 4-team model. I'll be interested in how things look early on, partly because, Warde Manuel is leading the charge, so that's interesting from a local standpoint, but also it'll give us a little bit more of a vantage point into what's important to the committee for team 8 versus team 14. Because remember, the reason why we didn't care too much about that for the last 10 years was because everything was going to get decided on the field from a conference championship standpoint, and there were only 4 spots. There wasn't a lot of movement necessarily in November for the teens of the rankings. Now that really matters. So I'm fascinated by it. One more I want to mention nationally, just a really cool thing. Army and Navy, both undefeated, both ranked, and both play Notre Dame later in the year. So you really want to mess with what's going on in the college football playoff area?
Oh, man.
Remember, the Army-Navy game takes place a little bit later. and the playoff bracket. So if one of those teams runs the table, aren't they the number one group of 5 team? They got to be.
I would think so, because right now your highest ranked team is Boise State. And if Army or Navy runs the table with a win over Notre Dame, you got to look at that and say, well, I mean, that's a great win. And obviously Army and Navy aren't going to play Boise State. So how do you differentiate? In Boise State, you look at their one loss is to Oregon. Is an Army or Navy win over Notre Dame enough to push them over the top of Boise State? And I got to believe it would.
Yeah. Boy, that would be, I don't think our Conquering Heroes guest on Tuesday, Warde Manuel, would be too enthused about figuring out. There was a situation, I think it was Navy, like, I don't know, 6-7 years ago, where they were in the running for that group of 5 spot in the New Year Six. So there was talk about a potential placeholder. Can you really put a placeholder in for a game that would take place in 6 days after the Army Navy game? They're still playing December 14th. So yeah,
well, it depends on where they would be ranked too, because if you're looking at, it's just the team who is going to be seated 12th, then all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, if you're going to wait that amount of time, then if it's Army or Navy and whichever one wins, you're in. If it's, if they both, and this is if they both beat Notre Dame, if one of them has a loss, then you're looking at, the winner, the undefeated one would obviously get in. If there's a loss, then does it push to Boise State? I think there's a number of different ways that chaos can rear its ugly head in this college football playoffs. And I'm just hoping
one. That's the way it could. Yeah, that's the way it would do it.
Yeah.
In totality, it would be, that'd be great. All right, number 7 on our 7 from 77. Unfortunate news, which is crazy to say when locally the Detroit Lions just absolutely bombarded the Dallas Cowboys on Jerry Jones' birthday, no less. But just sick for Aidan Hutchinson. Had to have immediate surgery after broken tibia and fibula in that win for the Lions. Aidan was a Defensive Player of the Year front runner for a Super Bowl contender, and just gutting news for a young man who obviously he was in so many ways one of, if not the most important individuals to propelling Michigan from 2-4 to a Big Ten championship, and then 3 straight, and then a national championship. And he had a similar role. He had a similar place for what happened with the Lions, and now he will almost certainly watch from the sidelines the rest of the year. It's just gutting.
It is, and what he meant to that team. Same thing he meant to Michigan, where he's a tone setter in the locker room, in the weight room, on the practice field, and just how he prepares himself for every individual game, how he prepared himself for the season. No one works harder, and when your stars work like that, everybody else has to raise their level, because they'll look and say, okay, well, if he's doing that, I better be doing it as well. And now he's gone. And it's production on the field too. 7.5 sacks through 5 games. And the rest of the team has 7.5 sacks, pass rush, win rate, all of those different things are, losses for the Detroit Lions. But if I know Aidan, if there's any chance that somebody could make a recovery, if the Lions are to get to the Super Bowl, that he could be a guy that would be able to participate, it would be him. I would bet on him. It's not likely, and I don't want to make any predictions to say, oh yeah, he can do it, because that's a tough one to come back from. I had a similar one, and it's tough. It's tough mentally, it's tough physically, and so they're going to have to find a way to fill a very large void that Aidan Hutchinson won't be there.
I just hope he's back to 100% week 1 next year. That would be a huge positive story for him. And it'll take a lot of work to get there. The other thing that happened this past weekend, again, it shows you, we all love football. We all follow football, but not only the Aidan Hutchinson injury, but Jim Harbaugh, a flare-up of his atrial flutter. So he had an uncommonly high heart rate. an arrhythmic situation, had to seek medical attention in the locker room. Jesse Minter was the interim coach briefly, came back to the sideline. They won all of that, but yeah, some scary stuff from former Wolverines here this weekend.
Yeah, and when you hear a coach taken to the locker room and, return is questionable, like, you just don't hear that very often. I saw the update, and I instantly text his brother-in-law just to see, hey, what's going on with Jim? Is he all right? And then to find out, obviously, he's back on the field. It's a scary situation because those that know him, those that care about him, want to know what's going on, and it's always a scary situation when you're talking about someone's heart. You're talking about something that's not normal, and especially in a situation where you don't see coaches leaving for medical attention.
No doubt. All right. Great stuff from Jon on the 7 from 77. On the audio side, let's get into a great conversation Jon had with Rod Moore. Here on the video stream, we have some fun to talk about. We used to do this a while back, back in the Bacon Fact days, for those early on in the podcast, where I think I got to like page 60 on the Google, Bacon Facts. We did a fourth and short. So kind of want to elaborate a little bit more on a few topics here on the video only aspect of the show. Just following up on the grades from last week, Jon, I want to start here with what unit or units have the best chance to you to jump to an A. You didn't give, I don't think you gave any A's last week. There were a few B's, but what unit or units have the best chance that can get to an A when we're talking about this, say, leading into Ohio State?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of them that could get there. Some of them have further to go. The easiest ones I'll talk about are defensive line and linebackers. Jayshon Barham and Ernest Hausman are really good. And as they continue to learn to play together, we saw what Ernie was able to do in that Washington game, how he learned, how he was able to make an interception on a play that maybe he should have had a pick earlier in the game. Saw the same thing, dropped a little deeper, and all of a sudden makes a play. We see those guys sideline to sideline downhill. They're very good players. I think they could have an opportunity to bump their grade up to an A. And that defensive line, they still are one of the most talented defensive lines. And in talking to Sherrone Moore, it's just simply, how do you play as a team? How do you win one-on-one matchups? Because they are going to have to be able to, if you're going to compete with Oregon or Ohio State, even Illinois this weekend, you're going to have to find ways to drop 7 into coverage, but still win on the pass rush up front. And when you're talking about guys like Derek Moore, who sounds like he's going to be back and healthy for this game, Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart, that's a formidable group, but they have to play as such, and they've got to play really good team defense. And so I think, just in terms of talent and expectations, it's all right there. They just got to follow through.
How about the units that most need to make a jump? If you could pick one or two that do get into that B+, A-, A range that several Michigan units were at last year, which ones would you pinpoint? Would you lock in and say, yeah, I'd love to see them get there because it gives Michigan a better chance against Oregon at home in a few weeks, at Ohio State at the end of the season?
Well, I'll give you two, and it will be reflective of where this offense goes. It's the O-line and the quarterback. You got to protect the quarterback. You got to be dominant running the football. That's what Michigan does, and you've got to be consistent in those areas. If they can improve their level of consistency, they could get close. But it will obviously determine how good or bad this offense is going to be. And obviously Jack Tuttle, or that quarterback position, you got to get consistent play. You got to get consistent decision-making, good decisions, protect the football. And it's, if you protect the football, if you just protect the football against Washington, you probably win that game. And I'm not going to, if you protect the football against Texas, I don't know if you win that game. They just were a really good team. But you've got to find ways to continue to protect the ball. That is the number one thing. This is number one job of the quarterback. And some of that's on the offensive line. Some of it's on protection. Some of it's on receivers. But if your quarterback play and your O-line play get to that B+, A range, Now, all of a sudden, it makes everything around them better. You get better production out of your running backs. You get better production out of your receivers, your tight end. You're able to utilize everything. Those are the two most important groups that have to play better in the second half of the season.
On that quarterback side, many have talked about how Michigan got here when it came to going from, in terms of wins and winning percentage, the best quarterback in Michigan history, to a third starting quarterback coming up here in game 7 of the season. So what's your take on that? How did Michigan get to this point? Was it to you in any way, shape, or form avoidable if things changed, if they were different? How do you go from what Michigan had to what Michigan has currently? And again, that's not the only problem with this team right now, but certainly that's the highest profile position. And for, the last 2 years from a starting standpoint, Michigan had one of the best in the country.
Yeah. I mean, it's recruiting and transfer portal. That's where and you look at the timing of things last year. And I know the excuse is, well, Jim Harbaugh didn't leave until January 24. All of the quarterbacks had already committed at that time. Sharon was hired on January 26. And it should have been, whether Jim Harbaugh was going to be here or not, there should have been, if they didn't believe that anybody on the roster was going to be able to play at a level that you need in the Big Ten, they should have gone out to be able to address the situation in the transfer portal or recruiting. And I know that Jaden Davis is on the roster. At some point, you got to find a way to get him some game reps to see what you have. But, the timing of it was an issue, but it should have been addressed by Jim Harbaugh. It should have been addressed, whether or not Sherrone Moore, I don't know if he felt like he was going to have the job. Most people thought that was going to be the succession plan. Maybe it was him going to Jim Harbaugh saying, this is what we need to do. Like there was an opportunity at a time. And I know JJ hadn't decided if he was going to go to the NFL or not, but you can't worry about feelings. You can't worry about, well, if this guy comes, then all of a sudden it's going to push this guy out. You have to do what's best for the program. And you go back to what Bo said, no man is bigger than the team. And you've got to go out there and make it. And then also, when Jim flirted with the NFL, each of the last 2 years, ultimately left this year in the third season, I think that had an effect on recruiting a quarterback. Is the coach going to be there? Who's going to be the coach after him? Is it going to be Sherrone Moore? Is this an offense that I want to operate in that's going to be a run-heavy offense? All of those things play a factor. So I don't think it's just one thing. I think it's a lot of things, but you've got to go out and find that next guy.
Anymore, if you are committing to a program because of a person being at that program, coach, player, administrator, whoever, right? That's probably not the best way to go about it because there's a lot of fluidity. But I do think if you are a quarterback and you are interested in Michigan, when Jim Harbaugh was here, Harbaugh played quarterback here. He is very passionate about the position. I understand why, if there are some ties to break, why you might pivot away, because Jim, to his credit, was very open with players and recruits and all that to many reports about his interest in going to the NFL over the last few years. But yeah, I think at the quarterback position, that's different than somebody who's being recruited as a linebacker or a receiver or a defensive back. So totally get that. Got about 10 minutes or so left. If folks have questions in the comments, we will certainly get to those. I want to get some quick hitters on John's college football playoff predictions as we sit here in mid-October. Your top 4 teams in the country right now, John Jansen.
Number 1's Texas. Number 2, Oregon. And this is where some debate could happen. Number 3 for me is Ohio State, and number 4 is Penn State. And I know Ohio State just lost, but they lost to a good team. And I mentioned this earlier in the program. Penn State, to me, just hasn't been tested. I know they had a game against Illinois. Illinois went down on the opening drive, put 7 points on the board on a scripted drive, but couldn't do much after that. Some of that was the defense of Penn State. Some of that was, just Penn State has more talent. But I need to see more from Penn State, and we won't really know until they host Ohio State in a couple of weeks. So that I'll hold to that. That Ohio State, to me, playing Oregon down to the wire, even though it's a game, maybe they should have won. Maybe it's clock management. Maybe it's coaching. There's a lot of different things. they were a team that could have easily won that game. Ultimately, they didn't. But I think if you put both Ohio State and Penn State on the field right now, I think Ohio State would win.
So, but you're saying if Penn State played Alabama or Georgia right now, they would win?
That's a tough question. They're not playing them. And
they might in December.
They might in December. But I don't think, like I mentioned earlier, Alabama's not the same Alabama. Their secondary is not what we've seen. The speed, the aggressiveness, the technique that they're playing with. And Georgia, I'm not sure what to make of Georgia with the almost loss to Kentucky, and then the loss to Alabama. It's just, when I look at these teams, I think to myself, I'm like, I just don't know how good they are. Yes, they're playing a tough schedule and much tougher than Penn State right now, but Penn State's taking care of business.
I think there is no team that has more to gain or lose in terms of national perspective in one game than Penn State at home against Ohio State. They win that game, everything's on the table. They lose that game, and yeah, that potential 11-1 record feels pretty hollow going into the CFP. Okay, you've got those three, Oregon, Ohio State, and Penn State, as three of your top 4 or 5. I won't hold you to that because I think you'd pick Georgia to beat Penn State. I don't know about Alabama, but I
don't know if I trust any of those teams right now.
True, yeah, no, for sure. Are those the only 3 to you that make the CFP from the Big Ten, or is there another one?
No, those are the only 3 that really have a shot at making the college football playoffs this year. I think the
Indiana.
SEC. No. The SEC, I think, could get as many as 5, depending on how things play out. And it's so much of it is not just the Big Ten teams or the SEC teams. It is they're playing tougher schedules than what we're seeing in the ACC and the Big 12. We talked about it earlier. I don't know. I mean, if there's one representative, you got to fill it with 12 teams somewhere. Army and Navy aren't both going to make it. Is Notre Dame going to be there? Like it's like this is where, and this is where I think it is kind of fun, is the level of talent is spread around college football anymore. It's not just in Tuscaloosa or in Athens or in Ann Arbor or in Columbus or in Union. Like there's a number of good teams, or in Austin. Like, but I think in you've got more talent in Austin than you do anywhere else, and they've shown it. Now they are going to have a test coming up with the game against Georgia, and we'll learn more about Georgia. We'll obviously learn a lot more about Texas as well.
Okay, so who is, if the Big Ten got 4, who would the 4th be to you? Who do you think that would be? Or who's the most likely to join those 3? It might be the winner of the game in Bloomington this weekend.
It's a possibility. I don't know. I can't imagine a world where Indiana makes college football playoffs. I just can't. I don't think they're there yet. I don't think there's any way that 4 teams make the college football playoffs unless Michigan finds magic with Jack Tuttle and they beat Oregon, they beat Ohio State. Now you could have that conversation, but I don't know that anybody is looking at that as reality.
Yeah. I mean, the SEC certainly to this point has balanced things out pretty well, where you can make cases for obviously Texas, Georgia, Alabama, LSU still, Tennessee still, Texas A&M has played really good football. Missouri's not out of it. I mean, the SEC, they're certainly in a really, really good position from that standpoint. Along those lines, John, who outside of the SEC and the Big Ten would have the best chance to make a run? Non-Big Ten or SEC team, who do you think has the best chance to make a run in the playoff?
The options, number 1, Miami. And that's just a matter of good quarterback play from Cam Ward throughout the season. Notre Dame out of the running. BYU is another team you could see. And mentioned earlier, see them be and I see them be 8-4. Like I don't know what the Big 12, but those 3 teams outside of the Power 2 that I would make a run in playoffs?
Connection's a little rough here. So I think we'll wrap here a couple minutes early. I do encourage fans to check out the conversation that John had with Warde Manuel. It's on Conquering Heroes. We flipped Conquering Heroes and Defend the Block this week because the conversation with Warde certainly very pertinent. Wanted to get out there as soon as possible. So that is out on the feed as of 9 a.m. this morning. So we encourage you to check that out. And certainly John and I will have a reaction to it as we go along throughout the course of the next few days and weeks. So for John Jansen, I'm Brian Bush. Thanks for stopping by here today. And of course, we'll be back next week with another live stream here on Michigan Athletics YouTube.